Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. I wanted to actually start by thanking Holly Morganelli and Eric Feldman for setting all this up. They've organized it fantastically, and I really appreciate that they put together an event like this. Also, I want to thank the New York Times for their sponsorship of this program. In this day and age of fake news, real news is more important than ever. And as I'll explain later, the New York Times actually is partially responsible for this project. I came up with the idea for the project while reading the New York Times. So a special shout out to them. And thank you to FIU for putting together a program like this as well. As Holly said, I grew up in South Florida, so I've watched FIU from the beginning. Not quite from the beginning, but from very early on, and to just see how it's grown, to walk around the campus, to see how dynamic it is. It's really an amazing experience, and I say this as a Florida native and also in a way as a Panther, because I too took classes at FIU when I was in high school. I learned Spanish here, so there you go. And the fact that I still had my ID from 150 years ago or whatever is really quite a sign of what it meant to me, actually. And so it's great to be back here. My research today is titled Hegemony and the Holocaust, State Power and Jewish Survival in Occupied Europe. It's based on the subject of my book, which just came out a few months ago. Many of you may know the story of Maurice Papon. Maurice Papon was the governor of Bordeaux, the region in France during World War II. France was under German occupation during World War II, so by being the governor of a region of France during World War II, of France under German occupation, Papon was a classic collaborator, right? He was helping indirectly the Germans implement some of their more infamous and their more notorious crimes. Well, after the war, Maurice Papon largely escaped justice for his complicity in these crimes. His claim had been that he didn't have anything directly to do with the worst of the Nazi atrocities, that he was really the governor of Bordeaux, but it was the local police forces on orders directly from Paris that had carried out the most egregious war crimes and such. And so his claim after the war was that he didn't have anything directly to do with the genocide, and therefore he escaped prosecution. He actually had a very successful career in France. He ran for parliament, he served in the parliament, he was a government minister, and then he retired. And thus, it was very embarrassing or inconvenient for Maurice Papon in the early 80s and the late 80s and the early 90s when documents like this came out. Documents that clearly had Maurice Papon's signature on them, documents that said things like that the following people, and it gave a list of Jews, were to be rounded up and deported immediately to a transit camp, which was the collection point for later deportations to Auschwitz. Suddenly, Maurice Papon's claim to have been unaware of, or at least uninvolved with, the worst of Nazi crimes, suddenly that claim dissolved. And so he found himself on trial. And this is where the New York Times comes in. I was starting work as a graduate student of political science without any particular interest in the Holocaust or World War II. But reading the New York Times and came across this story of the Papon trial. And it was fascinating. It was fascinating for all the classic reasons that something like this might be fascinating. It was fascinating also because I wondered what Papon's defense was going to be. I mean, this was not maybe the classic war criminal story where he'd gone into hiding and then they discover him 40 years later and he doesn't look anything like the original person and he can claim that he wasn't the original person. Everyone knew this was Maurice Papon. He'd never gone into hiding. In fact, he was still collecting a pension for his work for the French government, including for his work for the collaborationist government. So he couldn't claim that he wasn't the guy. And with documents like that, he couldn't claim that he had nothing to do with it. So I was really curious what Papon's defense was going to be. So in 2004, I asked him. I had the opportunity to interview Maurice Papon at his home, where he was serving out a sentence for crimes against humanity under house arrest. And what he said was fascinating. Note, I said fascinating, not necessarily convincing, but what he said was fascinating. Papon admitted that, yes, he had deported 1,500 Jews from Bordeaux. He said, however, that the Germans asked him for 10,000. And he said that he knew full well that Bordeaux had about 10,000 Jews at the time. He said that he understood furthermore that if he deported nobody, the Germans would have fired him, or worse, he says, and replaced him with somebody who would have deported everybody. And so his claim was that by deporting 1,500 people, he actually committed the lesser of two evils, right? That he was able to help the Germans a little bit and therefore keep his job and thus resist what would have been a worse situation had he just quit, had he refused to deal with the evil at all. So he actually credited himself for saving 8,500 Jewish lives at the cost of the few Jewish lives, in his words, that he had to sacrifice. Okay, well, I want to put aside for a second the question of whether we believe Maurice Papon. I've spoken to the man, the courts have spoken on this issue. That's a complex issue, and I want to just, at least for a moment, put that question aside and maybe turn our question to a different issue, which is not the if question, but the what if. What if there was some truth to this claim? What if, by staying in office and participating in some elements of Nazi atrocities, Maurice Papon was able to actually prevent worse atrocities from happening? What then would we make of this much more complex situation? I was also curious because Maurice Papon's claims echoed, in a way, the claims of Marshal Pétain. Marshal Pétain was the leader of Vichy France, of collaborationist France during World War II, and at his war crimes trial, he was infamous for saying, or famous for saying, depending on how you believe it, if I could not be your sword, at least I would be your shield. His idea was that by staying on as the leader of Vichy France during the occupation, by helping the Germans a little bit, he said that France was too weak for him to have acted as a sword and fought the Germans off. But so by staying in office, he was instead able to shield France from what he thinks would have been a worse fate, a more brutal and a more direct German occupation. Now again, focusing our question on not if that's a truthful claim, but what if that's a truthful claim, it caused me to reflect on one surprising factor, which was that in Vichy France, collaborationist Vichy France, a regime notorious for its collusion with the Nazis during World War II, in this regime, 75% of the Jews who lived in France during the war survived. Right? The percentage of the Jewish population in France at the time of the German occupation that was deported was 25%. Now, I want to rush to say that this doesn't mitigate at all the horror involved in tens of thousands of people involved in that 25%. But it does lead us to ask a comparative question, right? And it was the question that started this project. It was the question inspired in a way by my reading of that article in the New York Times in 1998. Why did more Jewish people survive in some German-occupied countries compared to others during World War II? And it struck me that I didn't have a very good answer, and I couldn't find a very good answer even when I started to look. For reasons that we'll get into in a minute, it wasn't any of the obvious things. And I reflected on it more, and I realized that there was this deep irony involved in the answer to this question. And that it was in a lot of cases in the countries that were cooperating with Germany more, especially more in military and economic affairs, where more Jews survived. And ironically, it was in many of the countries that resisted German rule most vehemently where the victimization rate was much higher. What it comes down to is the tragic logic of the way that Germany administered countries in its sphere of influence. That is to say, when Germany invaded a country or started to influence its will on a neighboring country, it often had a choice. It could rule that country very directly. It could remove all the locals from power and it could impose a very direct occupation on that country, remove the locals that were there, put German officials in charge, and when it did that, those officials could largely do what they wanted. On the other hand, Germany could take a more indirect approach. It could stay behind the scenes, leave local officials in power. Those people would be Germany's allies or its collaborators. But it turns out that when Germany ruled through collaborators, it also became reliant on those collaborators. After all, those collaborators helped Germany. They sent Germany weapons and raw material. They sent troops to the Russian front. And they could turn around and say to Germany, look, we are putting a local face on the German occupation. And that undoubtedly is pacifying the resistance and making this look at least less illegitimate than it otherwise would. The fact that we as collaborators are putting a local face on your German occupation. And so then they could turn around and they could negotiate, right? They could say to Germany, look, we're cooperating with you on military and economic affairs, so we demand these concessions when it comes to how you treat our own citizens. And it turns out that whether they meant it or not, whether they did so for the right or for the wrong reasons, and more on that in a minute as well, this often had the effect, sometimes the unintended consequence, of saving Jewish lives. That collaborators who stayed in office and helped the Germans in all kinds of ways, often unintentionally even, saved local Jews. Now, more in a minute on why they did this, but I want to at least put it out there. They didn't necessarily do so for the right reasons, right? These are Nazi German collaborators. They aren't protectors, right? But for the reasons on why they did that, more in a moment. But this gets to the title of the talk, Hegemony in the Holocaust. If you look at, I think it was freedictionary.com, the definition of hegemony is leadership or dominance, especially by one country over another. And what I realized that hegemony was the answer to this question of Jewish survival. I realized that if I wanted to know why more Jewish people survived in some German-occupied countries compared to the others, the answer was going to lie somewhere in hierarchy or hegemony, essentially the type of rule that Germany imposed on a given country. Okay, so a quick outline of what's to come. First, I want to give an overview of Jewish victimization around Nazi-occupied Europe, show the ways that it differed, show where it was higher and where it was lower, and at least give some early indication as to why. I then want to look at that relationship between German hierarchy and Jewish victimization rates, first just in Western Europe. It turns out that in Western Europe, I can control for a number of factors. Those countries are similar enough to one another that we can really see the logic of collaboration and its consequences if we look first just at Western Europe. And then after that, I want to widen our scope and look at how this worked out in Europe as a whole. Okay, so first, the overview of Jewish victimization rates. To restate the question, why did more Jewish people survive in some German-occupied countries compared to others during the war? Restating it maybe a little bit more precisely, what explained variation in Jewish victimization rates across the German sphere of influence? Okay, well, let's start by looking at those victimization rates. Here you have a table of countries in the German sphere of influence and the percentage of Jews in those countries that were deported or killed during the war. Now, I have to say that just in looking at this table, I was astounded by a few things. I mean, first of all, I looked at the number of countries where the survival rate was actually more than 50%. Now, again, not mitigating at all the horror that this entailed, that even in these better countries, the result is tragic, and that represents hundreds of thousands of innocent individual human lives, right? But this, at the same time, was Nazi Germany, right? This was a regime that stopped at nothing to attain compliance with its directives. It was a regime notorious for its efficiency. So how could it be that in totalitarian, efficient, brutal Nazi Germany, you had such inefficiency, thankfully, right, in the outcome of the final solution, such situations where so many people survived? And I also looked at the list, and it didn't match my pre-existing expectations. I looked at the case of Romania. Romania was arguably the most anti-Semitic country in Europe. It was brutally anti-Semitic, and yet this was a country where almost half of the Jewish population survived. You compare that with a country like the Netherlands, arguably the most religiously tolerant country in Europe. And so clearly something like anti-Semitism or religious tolerance, that wasn't going to be an easy explanation because it would have trouble explaining why the victimization rate would be comparatively lower in Romania than in religiously tolerant Netherlands. Finally, I looked at a country like Italy. Now, this is Mussolini's Italy, fascist Italy, one of Germany's closest allies, and its victimization rate was less than 20%. More than 80% of the Italian Jews survived the war. So clearly I had a puzzle. Right? Clearly the question I had, why did more Jews survive in some countries compared to others during World War II, was not going to have an easy answer. It was going to require looking into the role of collaborators and what their motives actually were. So why did this happen? Well, first it's worth saying that the collaborators often implemented partially German demands, or they were less enthusiastic than the Nazis themselves when it came to rounding up their own citizens. Now, this doesn't mean that they liked Jews, right? A lot of the collaborators themselves were also anti-Semitic. But it's one thing to be anti-Semitic and say that Jews should be subjected to different laws from our ordinary citizens or our non-Jewish citizens. It's another to go and arrest and deport your own citizens because Germany is asking for them. That became an affront to their nationalism, and a lot of these collaborators weren't going to deal with that. Likewise, and this is where it gets really into realpolitik and crass politicking, a lot of times collaborators would actually actively protect local Jews, but not necessarily for good reasons. They would do it for crass political or economic gain. So let's go to the case of Romania and see how this worked, right? The Romanian leader during World War II, Ion Antonescu, was brutally anti-Semitic and notoriously so. And so the Germans eventually thought, well, they thought that we'd have no problem implementing the final solution in Romania. Well, they asked Antonescu for his help, and Antonescu originally seemed very willing. He said, but don't worry, Germany, we'll take care of the Jewish problem ourselves. We know what a problem this can be. So Antonescu immediately imposed on his country a Jew tax. That is to say, the Jews of Romania had to now start paying much higher taxes than everybody else. Well, if you reflect on a minute, you can see that after that tax really got into place, the last thing Antonescu was ever going to do was to deport these people, because that would be killing the goose that lays the golden egg, right? He would rather exploit these people through outright extortion, right, and continually collect their resources rather than deport them and maybe get a one-time gain of confiscating their stuff, right? So it became more economically advantageous for him to essentially accept what amounted to a bribe or a tax from his local Jewish citizens and then prevent them from being deported to Germany. He also imprisoned many of them in his own work camps, and they went to work in brutal conditions, right, but working for the Romanian and then indirectly in a way for the German war effort as slave laborers. Another case that's fascinating is Italy, right? This is Mussolini's Italy. This is fascist Italy. The Germans ask for the Jews in Italy, and Mussolini originally is like, sure, we can do this. And he goes out and he arrests all the socialist Jews because he was an opponent of communism and of socialism, and so this was a great way for him to get rid of socialists, which he wanted to do anyway, and to please the Germans at the same time. Well, eventually, of course, the Germans catch on to what's going on, and they say, no, we want you to do large-scale deportations. And Mussolini says, well, look, I'm your ally. I'm helping you out a lot, so you have to make at least some concessions with this. He says, first of all, I want an exemption made. I want an exemption for Jewish veterans. There are veterans in Italy, people who've served in our army who are Jewish. And I can't be expected to deport people who've served Italy with their lives. I can't be expected to deport their family members either. And so he says, okay, we can deport the Jews from Italy, but not the Jews who are veterans and not their family. Well, okay. Mussolini also was always very careful to maintain good relations with the Catholic Church. That was an important force in his country. So he also said that he wasn't going to deport Catholic Jews. by which he means Jewish people who had converted to Catholicism, even Jewish people who had married Catholics, right? So they were part of a Catholic family, and people who were the product of a mixed marriage of a Jewish person and a Catholic person. These were all people that the Catholic Church in Italy had an interest in protecting, and Mussolini had an interest in protecting the Catholic Church because they were part of his support base. And then, and this seems strange at first, Mussolini also demanded an exemption for fascist Jews. That is to say, in Italy, fascism didn't have this same anti-Semitic undercurrent that it did in Germany. In Italy, fascism was intensely anti-communist. It was intensely nationalistic. But a lot of Italian patriots then were attracted to fascism regardless of their views about Jewish people, including some Italian Jews who were nonetheless proud of Italy. They'd served Italy, and so on and so forth. And so Mussolini says, look, I'll help you carry out the final solution in Italy, but you have to allow me a few exemptions here. I need exemptions for Jewish war veterans, for Catholic Jews, and for Jewish veterans. Well, if you reflect for a minute on how this must have worked out, the next day, many Jews in Italy run out to the local fascist party office, right? And they say, well, wait, where can we sign, right? We got to get this exemption here. We'll sign whatever papers we want if it allows us to not get deported. And so the fascist party, which was sort of teetering on the edge of legitimacy and losing a lot of support if the war wasn't going well, suddenly had this infusion of support with people who are trying to protect themselves and understandably so. Also, just mysteriously, with no good explanation, the number of Jewish converts to Catholicism exploded, right? And you even had priests, signing baptismal certificates, some of them sincere, some of them just a way to protect a fellow Italian citizen. So you had this constant undermining of the hegemonic relationship between Germany and its subject states, and that undermining was much more successful in cases where local leaders had a lot more autonomy. Okay, so how did this work when we look just at Western Europe? How did victimization rate vary as a result of German occupational forms? Well, let's talk a little bit about how Germany came to be ruling over Western Europe. In April 1940, Germany invades Norway and Denmark on the same day. About a month later, Germany invades Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. Now, to all of these countries, Germany gives an identical offer. Actually, it should be said that in May 1940, Gandhi says, I do not consider Hitler to be as bad as he's being depicted. He seems to be winning his victories without much bloodshed. More on why I'll include this in a moment if you want to know more later, but I think it's very interesting that the way we remember people in history is very different from the way they actually were. People are complex creatures. People, even good people, like Gandhi, have bad sides, or they make mistakes, or they make errors in moral judgment. And so I think when we reflect on people as angels or as criminals, we should actually realize that most people are neither, right? Most people at least have elements of the other, right? These are normal mortals. It's only later on that we turn them into saints or into villains. Well, be that as it may, Germany implements on all these countries or makes an offer to all these countries except France, surrender and we'll treat you gently, resist and we'll impose on you a very direct and brutal occupation. Well, of all the countries that got this offer, only Denmark accepts the deal. And it turns out that Germany then keeps its promise, because Denmark lays down its weapons almost immediately and says, yes, Germany, we'll cooperate. If you treat us more gently, we'll cooperate. Germany then allows Denmark a lot of autonomy. So Denmark keeps its prime minister. The prime minister administers over the same cabinet that was in charge before the war. In fact, the Danish parliament remains in session, and there are Jewish members of the Danish parliament, 3 Jewish members of the Danish parliament, who continue as members of parliament under German occupation, right? And the Germans deal with this as a part of the consequences, a part of the deal that they made for Denmark surrendering immediately. It's also worth saying that the Danish military remains in force, they remain armed, and they take up positions along the Danish coastline alongside German forces, protecting against an anticipated British invasion. So that's the deal that struck in Denmark. France, although not initially given this offer of surrendering for a less brutal occupation, after about 6 weeks of fighting, also makes a deal with the Germans, where also France is able to maintain a lot of autonomy. They maintain a complete domestic government. Germany is allowed to occupy the northern 3/5 of Germany. But France as a whole then is administered by the Vichy French collaborationist government, a government that also is a complete government. It has a French prime minister, a French cabinet, and a French bureaucracy. That's those secretaries general or the level of unelected bureaucrats that are part of a government. Now, this was very different from how things worked in other countries, right? In the Netherlands, in Luxembourg, countries that also got that deal, resist and suffer the consequences or give in and we'll treat you gently, those are countries that decided to resist. The legitimate leadership of the Netherlands fled the country. And they said, this is an illegal occupation. We refuse to legitimize it. And they set up a government in exile. I believe it was in Britain. It might have actually been in Canada for the Netherlands. I know that the Queen of the Netherlands actually sets up her office in Canada during the war. And what followed then in the Netherlands is that officials from all over the government started to step down. They refused to cooperate. The Supreme Court stepped down, the parliament was disbanded, and Germany filled the power vacuum with its own occupational officials. And that's this guy here, the Reichskommissar, is a German military, or actually SS, occupational authority. And that German occupational administrator, he has his own staff, the Reichskommissar's staff. Now that pink box indicates people who are local people. They're Dutch, but they're Dutch people that the Germans either vetted or picked. So you can imagine in the power vacuum, Germany fills that vacuum with its own officials, its own occupying force, and they then find locals who they think will be much more loyal to Nazi Germany and staff the bureaucracy with those people. Actually, in Luxembourg, it was an even more intense form of occupation. Germany actually just prepared to annex Luxembourg, to make it part of Germany. Now, the situation is a little different in these middle countries, in places like Belgium and Norway. Belgium was subjected to the rule of a military commander. The military had different interests than the Reichskommissar. The Reichskommissar was really a Nazi ideologue. He was very interested in implementing Nazi policy. Military officials are a little bit more professional. They just want to keep law and order. And if law and order was maintained, they were satisfied with that situation. And so for various reasons, including the fact that the Belgian king is ready to stay in the country and at least tacitly work with the German occupation, the Germans impose on Belgium a less brutal occupational force of a military commander and his staff, but they do that same vetting of the bureaucracy that went on in the Netherlands, right? Vetting it for people who were going to be loyal. If they thought that you would be disloyal, they'd fire you and replace you with a local person, but of Germany's choosing. And so you see these three administrative forms. You could have locals in power, that's the light box. You could have the red box, that's a German official in power. And then you could have the middle color, this pink, which is local officials, but local officials that Germany chose. So Norway, too, originally resists, just like Belgium and the Netherlands does. But for various reasons, Germany allows or actually appoints a local fascist from Norway as the prime minister. Now, this guy had no support in Norway by himself. In fact, when the parliament was in session, members of his party had no seats at all, right? So this was a small little discredited pack of Norwegian fascists. But for various reasons, Germany appoints that guy, his name was Quisling, to be the prime minister of Norway. And so Norway takes on this middle position of German-appointed governors,
but people who nonetheless were Norwegian. They were from the country in question. Well, what we have here is a hierarchy spectrum. What we have here is an example, looking at the bureaucracy and how it worked, of countries that were under very direct German rule and countries that were under very indirect German rule and a few middle cases. And it works out, when you look at the victimization rates, exactly as you'd expect. Look at the victimization rates in these countries, you see that precisely in those countries where Germany had direct control over the situation there, where the locals were removed from power and Germany administered directly, Germany then could largely do what it wanted. And in other countries where that wasn't the case, where Germany left a lot of local officials, a lot of local autonomy, well, then the survival rates got a lot higher for all kinds of reasons. You really want the reasons, buy the book. Okay, well, how did this work when we then look at at Europe as a whole, Europe under German occupation? Well, Germany, as you know, occupied countries all over Europe. It implemented similar policies with similar negotiations all over this German sphere of influence. And part of what this project entailed for me when I was working on the book was measuring these different German occupational forms so that I could put these countries on a spectrum, right? A spectrum that ranged from countries under very indirect German occupation, countries that were formally just allies with Nazi Germany, to countries under very direct German occupation, countries that were prepared for annexation, and everything in the middle. And what we see is a clear upward trend. Now, of course, you can, and many historians do, they'll quibble with my placement of any one individual case on this graph. Maybe Hungary shouldn't really be here, it should be over here. Maybe Belgium and the Netherlands shouldn't be on the same line because Belgium, after all, maintained its own king. Maybe it should be one step back. But it turns out that no matter what little changes you make, the overall trend is clear. That more direct forms of German rule led to more intense implementation of the final solution. Less direct forms of rule led to a lot of local Jewish survival. In fact, one thing I noticed, why isn't this showing up? That's unfortunate. What's supposed to happen now is that the PowerPoint would show a triangle. Because if you look at these cases, you see that it actually makes a triangular shape. It's not just a straight line, but up at the higher levels of German hierarchy, what happened is that local factors started not to matter. If Germany was in full control, Germany could do what it wanted. And the likelihood of locals to try to undermine or not undermine German efforts stopped mattering. Whereas at the lower ends of the hierarchy spectrum, where locals had a lot of autonomy, that's where at least there was the potential for those collaborators to intervene on behalf of their own citizens. Now, finally, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of all this. What does this have to do with contemporary political science? Well, first of all, it tells us a lot about military occupations, right? When a country invades another country, they also have a choice of how they're going to administer that country. And it turns out that occupation involves trade-offs. A country can get what it wants through a military occupation, but only at great cost. It's cheaper to rule through collaborators, whatever we call these people. It's cheaper to rule through a subject state and its officials if they're willing to help you out. But notice that when they're willing to help you out, they also start to expect a little bit in return. And so there's often a trade-off between more direct and more expensive forms of rule and less direct forms of rule, which are cheaper, but for which the leading power actually has to be willing to accept some limitations. Secondly, it tells us a lot about authoritarian regimes. I think we think about authoritarian regimes and dictatorships as being capable of implementing the policies that they want to. And I think that's true to a large extent, but authoritarian leaders also face real limits on their ability to implement that. But third and finally, and I think really interestingly, it tells us a lot about crimes against humanity and about this question of guilt or innocence. If you look at someone like Maurice Papon, Maurice Papon was rightly notorious for his crimes. Right? He was rightly notorious for his complicity in Nazi crimes. But what we've seen is that intentionally or otherwise, there were often consequences for this form of direct rule. And I think what this project shows us, right, what I think it'll help us understand is that a war crimes trial by its very nature is going to deliver a verdict. And that verdict will be guilty or innocent, as if real life only had these two choices. What I hope is that we get a more nuanced understanding of guilt and innocence by looking at this investigation of collaboration and its consequences. So I'm here to answer questions.
Yeah,
I want to hear from you. I want to hear your views on this. Yeah. What's your name?
Jonas.
Jonas.
Why did you choose to investigate this topic?
So it really came as a result of reading this article in the New York Times, and I don't just say that because the New York Times sponsors or underwrites this event. I really was a graduate student, and I was interested in authoritarian regimes. The question, if you could hear it all, was how did I get interested in this project? I was interested in authoritarian regimes, and I was interested in this interesting case where authoritarian regimes faced limits on their power, right? Where you think of an authoritarian regime able and willing to implement its policies at whatever cost. And here I was looking at a case where Germany, in some ways the most notorious totalitarian regimes, faced real limits. And so I was interested why an authoritarian regime like Nazi Germany might be limited in carrying out its aims. And I think so it really started as a nuts and boltsy kind of political science investigation, and it extended into this. I thought in some ways, if Nazi Germany was subjected to real constraints on its ability to policies, how much more so must this be the case of other dictatorships around the world? And in other more ordinary dictatorships, they too would be subjected to real limitations. Really difficult situation. I don't know what's going to happen. If I could predict the future, gosh, I wouldn't be in this line. I'd be investing in the stock market. But instead, I'm a college professor, which is wonderful. Because you get to have discussions like this and get paid for it. I really tell you, it beats working. Thank you guys. You guys are awesome. It's really a pleasure to be here. I appreciate it.